Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Ask Ralph the Evaluator. And I'm Ralph the Evaluator. Today's question again came from one of our book clubs. Great question. How do you get leadership to buy in to the evaluation? Remember, evaluating complex interventions using a systems approach is probably going to be a little more costly because the scope of the evaluation is generally bigger. And that scope is related directly to the number of moving parts in the intervention, right? So complex interventions got a lot of moving parts. Probably going to cost more to do. Getting leadership to want to do that, not so much. They tend to want to just do the bare minimum, whatever the funder requires, which tends to be, the logic model, which of course, see an earlier one of my earlier videos is completely inappropriate. Well, not completely, but mostly a poor fit for evaluating complex interventions. So how do you get, leadership who is like, well, this is probably just extra stuff at this point because it's not required by the funder. How do you get them on board? What do you do? And that's tough, but I want to share a screen here to explain why this question is so important. And then I'm going to give you a couple tips on how I was able to move leadership to adopt and invest in doing a systems evaluation, because that, in fact, is the correct approach for, or at least a better approach for evaluating complex interventions. So I'm just going to share my screen here real quick and just bring up this PowerPoint presentation for you. So first of all, I want to give credit to the Haynes Center for Strategic Management, Dr. Louis Atkinson. He has been a wonderful mentor. If you need or want to understand anything about systems, Louis is a go-to resource. Dr. Louis Atkinson. He's out of Australia. He lives in Brisbane. Great guy, super valuable in terms of helping me move along my systems journey. So a big shout out to Louis. Louis, thank you so much for being a friend and a mentor. But Louis shared this particular diagram with me a few years back, and I find it extremely useful to think about systems. And it dovetails nicely with system evaluation theory. And in fact, I use his diagram in my book and tie it together with a few other concepts. So, but today's question really all gets at this bottom part, the base of this pyramid, right? This whole culture piece, this culture and commitment piece down here. And, but we're talking about the culture and commitment from two standpoints, right? The first is the commitment to the evaluation approach itself. And the second is actually the commitment to wanting to operate and function as a system. So those are kind of two different levels, but both require the commitment of leadership to do that. So leadership is instrumental in setting the culture. If they say, hey, we want you to do this systems eval, or hey, we want you to start working together, your different components of this intervention, you need to be working together interdependently, they can set that tone. And as you can see, they'll also be the ones then that provide the resources and so forth to make the changes to the structural changes that are needed to the system and the procedural changes that are needed to the system to reinforce both the operational efficiency of the complex intervention itself and to support the development of the evaluation components to support the evaluation of those structures and processes. So, but how do you do that? How do you actually get folks to buy into that? And in my experience, I've had to do what I call subliminal evaluation. So what do I mean by subliminal evaluation? What I mean is you can't come full on like a bull in a china shop and say, hey, to hell with the required evaluation. We know that the systems approach is going to be better for evaluating this complex intervention. That will never fly. And I think most of you probably know that that won't fly. So we're mostly in a situation of having to check off the boxes for the required components of an evaluation, and then trying to convince leadership to engage maybe in a more appropriate evaluation approach based in systems and systems thinking. So how do we do that? Well, my suggestion is you start very small. You start with something, a simple systems concept. You don't need to apply immediately the whole sort of set approach to evaluating a complex intervention. You can start with just some of the system concepts that are discussed in the book. And a very common one that everybody knows, for example, is the feedback loop. So just do the normal evaluation. In part of your process evaluation, look for a place where there's a connection going on between components, where they're interacting or having to communicate with each other, cooperate with each other. Preferably, they are dependent on each other. And look at that little place where there's and it's usually a place where there's an information exchange of some type. And just evaluate that feedback loop very simply. Just look at some of the basic criteria of a feedback loop. Again, I discuss those in the book. For example, is that feedback loop being closed? Sometimes it's not even closed. Is the information in that feedback loop relevant? Is it deemed credible? Is it coming at the right time? Is it coming at the right frequency? These are all kinds of aspects of the feedback loop that you can evaluate. And then you can provide that information right back to leadership very quickly. And that's the nice thing. So, you know, if there's some dysfunction in that feedback loop, you note what that dysfunction is. For example, hey, the information's coming too late. Or, hey, you know, there's so much information coming that the person can't decipher what's noise and what's the information they should be acting on. So that little chunk of information you can provide immediately to leadership, and leadership will go, oh, it'll make sense to them normally because it's actually part of a process. It's how they really work, right? It reflects their operational reality is what I like to say. And so the information will be meaningful from that standpoint. They'll go, yep, I know exactly where that process happens. And yep, I can see why that's falling apart. And the change is usually fairly simple to make, especially around a feedback loop. It's like, well, how are we going to close that loop? Or how are we going to make the information deemed more credible? Or how can we get the timing of the information to come when it's needed? And they can usually act on that information fairly quickly. And that's a really nice feature compared to normal evaluations, which often you will wait until the end of a program is delivered before you'll offer your recommendations. But here, you'll be able to provide what I call near real-time feedback. And that is beneficial because obviously it's more relevant, it's happening in real time, but it's also in an actionable chunk. Like, sometimes when we develop an evaluation report and we wait to the end of the year, what happens? What happens is you got 30 recommendations stacked in there, and it just overwhelms people. They don't even know where to start. So if you give them just a little piece of information, like how to fix this feedback loop, or a little recommendation around that, that they'll act on it. That will give them confidence that the systems evaluation approach maybe is a good way to go. And you just build up slowly like that. You build the trust and the confidence by just using parts of system concepts and apply them to the evaluation. And that won't be too costly, and it'll be a way to build that confidence. Now, we did that at the Center for Translational Research that I was evaluating with the leadership there. And I got to tell you, the leadership at first was not convinced on this whole systems approach. And I can't tell you the words, actually, when I explained what we wanted to do, what the reaction was, because, you know, we want to keep this something that we can publish publicly and not have a lot of restrictions. But as a result of this sort of subliminal approach, just taking incremental pieces, we were able to convince leadership that this really was worth investing in and a better way to go, because it gave them more meaningful and actionable information to act on. So that would be the way that one could sort of get leadership to buy into the evaluation. You have to kind of do it incrementally, just take on little pieces, something very manageable, easy, doesn't cost a lot, something that you understand yourself. And I think a feedback loop is usually the easiest place to start. So that's what I would suggest. Now, what difference does all of that make? Well, look, the proof is in the pudding, as they say, or in the eating of the pudding. And what we did, I was mentioning those near real-time near real-time recommendations that we were making. We started to track whether those recommendations we were making made any difference at all. And remember, like the power in evaluation, right? Like our evaluations are only useful if people use the information that we give them, right? They find the decision makers are able to find that information useful. Now, they may not always agree with your recommendation. That's fine. But I really want to know is, are they even considering the recommendation? And if they're considering it, are they adopting it? And if they adopted it, what level did they adopt it to? Those were kind of the three things. And we published these evaluation utility metrics in the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation, if you're interested in reading more about that. Well, and I don't know what your experience is, but my experience in the past has been just terrible with getting recommendations implemented. And I would be lucky if in most of my reports, 10% of those recommendations ever got implemented. And that's using your sort of your traditional theory-driven evaluation, logic model, kind of process evaluation approach, right? And it was disappointing, right? It's disheartening. Like our work's not being used. You feel like, okay, great. They got their checkbox. That's all they care about, that the evaluation was completed. And sometimes that is enough to get the funding, but it's certainly from a professional standpoint, demoralizing, really, when the information is not being used. So we started tracking when we use the systems approach, and again, providing sort of these incremental pieces and recommendations in near real time. And we got our evaluation utility up to 80%. 80% of our recommendations, well, first of all, 100% were considered, and 80% of them were adopted, and usually within the first couple of weeks. Now, that's pretty powerful stuff. So, and that's the evidence that, you know, leadership came from a place where they didn't want anything to do with it, it being the systems kind of approach, to complete buy-in. But again, it was done sort of incrementally. And as I said, I call it sort of subliminal evaluation, where you're just going to do it. It's not going to add a lot of cost, and people are going to start to see the benefit and then ask, hey, what was that? How did you do that? And can we apply that thinking more broadly now to the rest of evaluating this complex intervention? Hope that helps answer the question. I encourage you all still to sign up for a book club, right? I do that every episode, every edition of Ask Ralph the Evaluator. Sign up for a book club. Go to justevaluation.com and look for the book club and RSVP. And when we get a critical mass together, when we get about 8 to 10 people, we'll create a book club. Again, no cost to you other than the book. We'll organize it for you and do all the logistics. And I'll drop in once in a while to those book clubs and answer any questions that you have. In the meantime, keep up the good work. And don't try to make things that you know how to do fit evaluating complex interventions, right? Don't do that. Get on that systems journey. When you realize that you need those particular tools to evaluate a complex intervention, don't be scared. Jump in, use the book. It'll help guide you through the steps that you need to do. And you can always reach out to me with more questions. In the meantime, take care.